And the last big story we want to talk about this week is a new bill that's been introduced in the U.S. Senate. It's by Senators Angus King from Maine, the independent from Maine, and Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. They introduced the Gas-Operated Semi-Automatic Firearms Exclusion Act, or GO-SAFE Act. Basically, it's just another attempt at an assault weapon ban, but they went about it in a pretty novel way in terms of how they're defining the weapons that will be banned. So, pretty big deal that they're going back to the well for an assault weapon ban, and it's interesting the way they're going about it this time.
Yeah, definitely, and it's particularly interesting because of who's involved. Right, you had King and Heinrich. You also had Bennett, and there was a fourth. Who's the fourth?
Mark Kelly from Arizona.
Yeah, Mark Kelly from Arizona. Now these are. It's interesting because these guys have had a reputation of being more moderate as far as Senate Democrats go on gun policy. King was involved in blocking Chipman from becoming the ATF director. These other guys have not made gun control a major part of their platforms, although obviously Mark Kelly is married to Gabby Giffords, who runs a gun control organization. And I will say that all of them at some point have supported assault weapons ban. So it's interesting, right? Because they're certainly not the people out in front of this issue generally. Right. And that's one thing that makes it newsworthy to me.
Right. It's not Chris Murphy, for example,
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's also not, John Tester or Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema. So they don't have those people on board. They don't have any Republicans at this point. And I do feel like if they were likely to get somebody like Susan Collins, the other senator from Maine, on board, they would have already done that. Now it's not impossible she joins now that they've announced. Maybe they just didn't coordinate things very well. That seems unlikely to me. Like they probably did try to get her on board, and she's not on board. So they have no Republican support. They don't even have the most moderate of Democrats on this issue, Tester and Sinema and Manchin on board. So it tells me that they probably don't even have 50 votes for this, even still. That's why the assault weapons ban that passed the House last year never came up for a vote in the Senate, most likely not because of the filibuster, which is what gets blamed, but because they probably don't have 50 votes for one. This does seem, as you alluded to there, as a kind of a rebranding, a tactics change to try and jumpstart this in the Senate among at least Democrats, try to get all 50 Democrats on board, or 51 Democrats on board at this point. And I don't know we'll see if it works, but that's, I think, what makes it particularly interesting. But yeah, also what makes it interesting is just the way it's written, as you're getting at. Like, you did a whole analysis piece. Let's just walk through real quick some of the oddities in this bill. Like what is, and this is going to be hard to explain to somebody who actually knows about firearms terminology, right? Because you heard from the name, right? They put in gas operated as part of the definition. And Angus King is going out. He was on MSNBC. And he was selling this as kind of less a moderate approach to assault weapons bans and more like a response to some of the common criticisms of assault weapons bans being focused on cosmetic features or ergonomic features, things like pistol grips or telescoping stocks, stuff like that, is what has traditionally made a type of semi-automatic rifle banned. Instead, they're focused on, they really just don't have any feature exceptions is what they do. And they try to imply that this is based on the operating system of the gun, gas operated, right? But the problem, I guess I can let you explain. What's the big problem with that? How do they define gas operated?
Yeah, so essentially their definition of I can actually probably read it to you here, but essentially for all intents and purposes, their definition of gas operated is essentially just semi-automatic. It says a gas operated semi-automatic firearm is one that, quote, harnesses or traps a portion of the high gas pressure from a fired cartridge to cycle the action. Which, that's how all semi-automatic firearms operate, right? To one extent or another.
But that's not the definition that most people who understand guns would use for gas operated. Gas operated, they do lay out like piston driven gas operated direct impingement. gas operated guns in the part of their gas operated definition. But the problem is then they also include things like blowback and recoil operated guns, which traditionally in the gun space, at least, they aren't considered to be gas operated because they're not using, siphoning off some of the gas from the that's expelled when you shoot a round to actually operate the gun. They rely on just strictly the forces being propelled backwards, recoil or blowback.
Right.
You could all these things you could say in theory are involved the gas being expelled
Right.
when you fire a gun, but that's not how it has traditionally been broken down
right.
For most people who talk about this level of gun knowledge, right? Like if you're watching Forgotten Weapons or some Ian McCollum over there, that kind of stuff, you're looking at how the gun actually operates. Gas operated doesn't usually mean, people don't take that to mean recoil operated or blowback, but that's what this bill does define it that way.
Right.
But and so it sort of essentially bans any semi-automatic rifle, right, that can accept a detachable magazine.
Right. Essentially, the definition bans all semi-automatics, but to get around the controversy of, obviously, I think that would be a bridge too far for most people. Yeah. They just put in exceptions in there to say, well, we're not talking about semi-automatic shotguns. We're not talking about recoil operated handguns. So by their definition of what's banned, it's all semi-automatics. But they're like, but this doesn't apply to these things that also fall within this definition, but we don't care about those as much. So that's kind of how they get around that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It basically bans any semi-automatic that can accept a magazine. And then it makes a bunch of exceptions for all. There's some really broad ones. Like you mentioned, all semi-automatic shotguns, for whatever reason, are exempted regardless of how they operate. I don't know why. And then some semi-automatic handguns are accepted, or I guess most of your popular ones,
right?
Recoil operated. So your Glocks and your Smith & Wesson M&P line, or your SIG 320s, whatever, stuff like that. Although it would still ban a bunch of other stuff, like even like a high point, right? High points are straight blowback guns. That's why their slides are so thick, because it only exempts recoil operated.
That's right.
Your Browning tilt action guns, your 1911, stuff like that. Anything with a fixed barrel, like even like so really high end stuff like the Lago Alien would probably be banned under this, because it's blowback with a gas delay system, and we're getting really into the details of this. But it's just kind of funny, because it's like you read this bill and it's people, whoever wrote this, it's like they looked up some terms, didn't really understand them, and then just tossed them in here. Because like they exempt things, for some reason they go out of their way in the semi-auto ban to exempt things that aren't semi-automatic anyway. Like bolt action handguns are exempted, written into the law as an exemption. It's pretty bizarre the way they did this. And you have a lot more detail in your members piece, which, by the way, our Black Friday sale is still going on. It'll end on Monday when this goes public, but people still have a chance to go and buy a membership for 20% off. We don't do those sales very often, so I would say take the opportunity, and you can go and read every weird detail about this bill, because there's a lot more than what we're getting at here.
Yeah,
they even go after, there's this sort of bump stock ban written in here, and it exemplifies exactly why there was concern about doing that legislatively in 2018, or after the Las Vegas shooting, because the way they've written this into law could certainly be construed to ban basically any modification to any semi-automatic of any kind. They don't, for some reason, they don't include gas operated there. It's just semi-automatic. So it would include your regular Glock or Smith & Wesson handguns, and anything that makes it fire materially faster. So
yeah, I
would imagine that would include things like upgraded triggers, stiffer recoil springs, even a grip, perhaps, you change out your grip module and you can shoot faster than you could before because you can get a better grip. That materially increases the rate at which you can fire the gun. Now, it doesn't change the cycling speed of the gun, right? But the goal here seems to be more about your ability. I mean, the bump stock doesn't change the cycling speed of a gun. It just lets you pull the trigger faster than you otherwise would be able to. So yeah, and there's even more than that. There's a whole private right of action. If the AG gets a lot of power in this to just decide what they think are gas operated guns, semi-automatics that are subject to this ban. There's a whole bureaucratic process put in place for that. And there's even a private right of action for opposing the attorney general. If you think a gun should have been on the list and it was taken off. So there's a lot. People should go check out your piece about it. It's a very odd bill.
Yeah, it's an odd bill. People should check it out. Like we said at the top of this segment, it's probably dead on arrival. It's not going to pass, at least through the 2024 election. But the fact that they went to this strategy, I think is at least noteworthy. That people should, it's important as a story for people to see the strategic, because obviously assault weapon bans have been introduced for, since the 90s. And
they've kind of been stalled since then. Yeah. I mean, you've had a couple in recent years. You've seen like Delaware and Illinois.
Sure. At the state level, they've passed the traditional ones, but obviously at the federal level, it's gotten nowhere. And so to see a new strategic attempt to try to repackage one, I think is noteworthy because maybe it could be a new trend. So